The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of courtroom 7B, casting long rectangles of light across the worn wooden benches. Kiana Johnson sat in the third row, her hands folded neatly in her lap as she tried to control her breathing. The 17-year-old had spent nearly an hour that morning making sure she looked presentable. A navy blazer borrowed from her aunt, pressed slacks, and her hair pulled back in a neat bun. A small stack of papers rested on her knee, containing her driver's license information, insurance details, and a carefully written statement about the alleged rolling stop that had brought her here today. Around her, the courtroom buzzed with quiet conversation. A middle-aged woman dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, while whispering to what appeared to be her son. An older gentleman in a plaid shirt repeatedly checked his watch. 2 rows ahead, a young man in a suit scrolled through his phone, occasionally typing something with quick, nervous movements of his thumbs. Docket number 47293, Johnson traffic violation, called out the court clerk, a thin woman with glasses perched at the end of her nose. Kiana stood up, smoothing her blazer and gathering her papers. Her heart thumped wildly in her chest as she made her way to the defendant's table. She'd practiced what to say all week, rehearsing her words in front of the bathroom mirror until her little brother had pounded on the door, complaining about needing to brush his teeth. From the elevated bench, Judge Walter Harrington looked down at her. He was in his 60s with a crown of silver hair and deep-set eyes beneath bushy eyebrows. His black robe seemed to swallow his frame, giving him an imposing presence that made the courtroom feel suddenly smaller. He glanced at the papers before him, then back at Kiana, his expression shifting subtly. "Ms. Johnson," he said, drawing out her name with a hint of something Kiana couldn't quite place. "Approach the bench." Kiana walked forward, her sensible shoes making little sound on the carpeted floor. She stood with her back straight just as her mother had taught her. "Good morning, Your Honor," she said clearly. The judge's eyebrows rose slightly. He leaned back in his chair and tilted his head. "Well now, ain't you dressed up fancy today?" he said, his formal courtroom tone sliding into something different. "Got yourself all proper-like for court." A few nervous coughs echoed from the gallery behind her. Kiana blinked, momentarily thrown off by his change in speech. "Yes, Your Honor. I believe it's important to show respect for the court," she replied evenly. Judge Harrington's mouth quirked. "Respect, huh? That's a big word. You learned that in school or on the street?" The question hung in the air, awkward and pointed. The court clerk glanced up from her computer, her fingers pausing over the keyboard. "I'm a senior at Westridge High School, Your Honor. I'm an AP English and serve as the vice president of our debate club," Kiana said, her voice steady despite the confusion building inside her. Why was he speaking to her this way? AP English? The judge repeated with exaggerated surprise. "Fancy education. Your parents must be real proud. They here today?" His eyes scanned the courtroom briefly. "My mother couldn't get time off work, Your Honor. She's a nurse at Memorial Hospital and works double shifts on Thursdays." The judge nodded slowly. "And your father?" Kiana hesitated, feeling her cheeks warm. "He's not in the picture, Your Honor." "Of course he isn't," Judge Harrington muttered, just loud enough for those in the front rows to hear. Someone behind Kiana shifted uncomfortably on the wooden bench. "Now let's see what we got here," the judge continued, flipping through the paperwork before him. "Rolling stop at Maple and 5th. Officer notes you were argumentative during the stop." He looked up at her with narrowed eyes. "You got a problem with authority, Ms. Johnson?" "No, Your Honor," Kiana replied, her hands gripping her papers more tightly now. "I was simply trying to explain to the officer that I did come to a complete stop. There was a delivery truck partially blocking the view and I was extra careful because of it." The judge hummed, sounding thoroughly unconvinced. "And I suppose that fancy car you was driving is yours too?" Kiana swallowed. "It's my mother's car, Your Honor. I have permission to drive it and I'm listed on her insurance." She held up one of her carefully prepared documents. "I have the paperwork here." Judge Harrington waved his hand dismissively. "Your mama let you take her nice car. Generous woman. What you doing in that part of town anyway? Maple and 5th ain't exactly where I'd expect to find a young lady from." He paused, looking at the address on the citation. "From your neighborhood." The implication in his tone was clear. Maple and 5th was in the affluent part of town, where large homes sat back from tree-lined streets and luxury cars filled driveways. Kiana's address was in a working-class area across the river. I was returning home from my internship at the public library's archive department. Your Honor, they're digitizing historical documents, and I help 3 afternoons a week after school. For the briefest moment, something flickered across the judge's face. Surprise, perhaps, or disbelief. But it was quickly replaced by the same condescending expression he'd worn since she approached the bench. A library job, reading books and such. He nodded slowly. Better than some of the alternatives for young folks these days, I suppose. A hot flush crawled up Kiana's neck. She'd earned that internship through a competitive application process. It wasn't just reading books. She was helping preserve the city's historical records, learning database management, and building skills for her planned career in information science. May I present my statement about the traffic stop, Your Honor? She asked, lifting her prepared explanation. No need for all that, Judge Harrington said, waving her off again. I think I got the picture pretty clear. He leaned forward, elbows on his desk, fingers steepled. Ms. Johnson, you seem like you're trying to do something with yourself, and I appreciate that. Not enough of that where you come from, I expect. The courtroom had grown uncomfortably quiet. The clerk had stopped typing altogether now, her eyes fixed on her screen as if afraid to look up. The bailiff by the door shifted his weight from one foot to the other. Your Honor, Kiana began. With all due respect, let me give you some advice, the judge interrupted, his voice taking on what he might have thought was a fatherly tone, but landed as patronizing. These fancy internships and AP classes, that's all well and good. But you need to understand how the real world works. When an officer tells you something, you say yes, sir, and no, sir. You don't argue. That's how young people like yourself end up in real trouble. Kiana stood perfectly still, her face a careful mask. Inside, a storm was brewing. Confusion, anger, humiliation. But she'd been taught never to show too much emotion, especially not in situations like this. Her mother's words echoed in her mind. You have to be twice as careful, twice as respectful, twice as good. Do you understand what I'm telling you? Judge Harrington asked, his tone suggesting he was doing her a great favor with this wisdom. Yes, Your Honor, Kiana replied quietly. The judge nodded, satisfied. Good. Now, given this is your first offense, I'm going to be lenient. Citation dismissed with a warning. He pointed his gavel at her. But I want you to remember what I said. Stay in school, keep your nose clean, and learn some respect for the law. He struck his gavel once, the sharp crack echoing through the hushed courtroom. Next case. Kiana gathered her unused papers, her fingers slightly trembling now. She turned to walk back to her seat, feeling dozens of eyes on her back. Some held pity, others discomfort, a few with barely concealed outrage on her behalf. The young man in the suit who had been on his phone earlier caught her eye briefly and shook his head slightly, as if in apology for what he had witnessed. As she collected her bag and prepared to leave, Kiana noticed the court reporter watching her. The woman's eyes held a knowing look, as if this scene had played out before in this very courtroom, with different young people standing where Kiana had stood. Outside, the autumn air felt cool against Kiana's flushed cheeks. She walked down the courthouse steps slowly, her mind replaying every word, every tone, every implication from the judge. The dismissal of her case should have felt like a victory, but instead, a heavy weight pressed on her chest. At the bottom of the steps, she paused and took a deep breath. Then, with deliberate movements, she pulled out her phone and opened her notes app. With quick, precise taps, she documented everything that had just happened. The judge's words, his tone, the reactions of the courtroom staff, the time and date. When she finished, her finger hovered over the save button for just a moment before pressing it firmly. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. But Judge Walter Harrington wouldn't know that until it was too late. The sleek glass elevator climbed swiftly to the 14th floor of the State Justice Building. Kiara Johnson stood alone inside, watching the numbers illuminate one after another. Gone was the borrowed blazer and simple bun. Today she wore a charcoal pantsuit, her natural hair styled in a professional twist, and carried a genuine leather portfolio embossed with her initials. As the door slid open with a soft chime, she stepped out and walked confidently down the carpeted hallway to a corner office. He took the bait, Kiara announced as she entered the spacious room where Thomas Chen, her supervisor at the State Judicial Review Board, waited. He looked up from his computer, removing his reading glasses. That didn't take long, Thomas said, gesturing for her to take a seat. How bad was it? Kiara placed her portfolio on the polished conference table and pulled out a tablet. Worse than we expected, and completely on record. She tapped the screen a few times and slid it across to Thomas. I recorded everything on my phone. The court reporter's transcript should back it up word for word. Thomas scrolled through her detailed notes from the courtroom encounter, his frown deepening with each swipe. He actually spoke to you in that fake slang? In open court? Oh yes, Kiara said, pouring herself a glass of water from the carafe on the table. The whole ain't you dressed up fancy routine. Asked if my father was in the picture, which, by the way, he didn't ask any of the white defendants. I checked the morning's transcripts. Unbelievable, Thomas muttered, continuing to read. And this comment about your neighborhood? Classic dog whistle, Kiara confirmed. The best part? The clerk and bailiff looked uncomfortable the entire time. They know exactly what he's doing. Thomas set the tablet down and leaned back in his chair. At 52, he'd spent most of his career working to maintain judicial integrity, and cases like this clearly weighed on him. We've had complaints about Judge Harrington for years, but nothing ever stuck. Witnesses would recant, recordings would go missing, or the behavior would be explained away as tough love for troubled youth. That's why we had to try something different, Kiara said. She reached for her portfolio again and removed several folders. The undercover approach was risky but necessary. No one can claim I misunderstood or misinterpreted what happened. I experienced it firsthand. And you're sure he had no idea who you really are? Kiara smiled. I'm 28 but can easily pass for a teenager when I need to. It's been both a blessing and a curse throughout my career. In this case, definitely a blessing. Plus, I deliberately used my real last name because if he'd bothered to look me up properly, he might have discovered I'm an attorney. That would have been telling in itself. Thomas nodded appreciatively. Smart move. I learned from the best, she replied with a quick smile. But we're just getting started. Today was only the first piece of evidence. What's your next step? Kiara opened one of her folders, revealing a meticulously organized timeline. We need to establish a pattern of behavior. One incident won't be enough to remove someone with Harrington's connections from the bench. He's been a judge for 15 years and has friends in high places. The Chief Justice plays golf with him, Thomas confirmed. They were in law school together. Exactly, Kiara said. So we need to be thorough. I've already requested court records for all his cases over the past 5 years. We'll analyze sentencing patterns based on defendants' race, gender, and neighborhood. I've also identified several former defendants willing to speak on record about their experiences. She pulled out another document, a spreadsheet listing dozens of names with contact information and case numbers. Most people don't come forward because they fear retaliation or simply don't know how to file a complaint. But when I tell them we're already investigating, they're more willing to share their stories. Thomas scrolled through the list, impressed. You've been busy. I've been preparing for this for months, Kiara said. Ever since we received that letter from the public defender's office noting the disparity in sentencing for their clients appearing before Harrington. The memory of that letter, detailing how Black and Latino defendants consistently received harsher sentences than white defendants for identical offenses, had fueled Kiara's determination to take on this case. As one of the few Black attorneys at the review board, she understood the significance of addressing systemic biases in the judicial system. There's also the courthouse staff, she continued. Several clerks and even a bailiff have hinted they have stories to tell. They're scared of losing their jobs, but I'm working on securing confidentiality agreements that will protect them. Thomas's phone buzzed with a message. He glanced at it briefly before returning his attention to Kiara. The director wants an update by the end of the week. We need to move quickly but carefully. Harrington has survived complaints before. This time will be different, Kiara assured him. She stood and walked to the window overlooking the city. From 14 stories up, she could see the courthouse where she'd stood before Judge Harrington just hours earlier. He didn't just show bias today, he performed it. And that performance is now evidence. Thomas joined her at the window. You know this won't be easy. The old guard protects their own. They'll say you were deceptive, that you set him up. We didn't create his bias, Kiara replied. We simply provided an opportunity for it to reveal itself. Everything he said and did came from him, not us. She turned away from the window and gathered her materials. I should get back to my office. I need to prepare for tomorrow's phase, which is court observation, Kiara said. I'll be sitting in the gallery all day, documenting how he treats different defendants. Then I'll compare his behavior with the case files. She tapped her tablet. Numbers don't lie. If he's giving white defendants probation while sending black defendants to jail for the same offenses, the data will show it. Thomas nodded. Be careful. If he recognizes you, he won't, Kiara assured him. Tomorrow I'll be a completely different person. Professional attire, glasses, hair pulled back. Taking notes like a law student observing court proceedings, hide in plain sight. As she gathered her things to leave, Thomas asked one final question. Why did you volunteer for this assignment, Kiara? You could have taken on less controversial cases, made fewer waves. Kiara paused at the door, considering her answer. When I was 16, my cousin went before a judge not unlike Harrington. Minor offense, skateboarding where he shouldn't have been. The judge spoke to him like he was hardened criminal, made assumptions about his home life, his future, everything. Gave him community service when white kids were getting warnings for the same thing. She adjusted her grip on her portfolio. My cousin was so discouraged by how he was treated, he started believing that's all he'd ever be, what that judge saw. It took years for him to rebuild his confidence. Her voice strengthened. No judge should have the power to diminish someone like that, especially not a child. And definitely not based on the color of their skin. Thomas nodded slowly. Well, if anyone can build this case, it's you. I plan to, Kiara said firmly. Back in her own office, smaller than Thomas's but still with a decent view, Kiara spread her materials across her desk. She pulled up the court docket for the next day, examining the list of defendants scheduled to appear before Judge Harrington. She noted their names, charges, and whatever demographic information was available. Next, she opened her laptop and reviewed the video she'd secretly recorded during her court appearance. Watching Judge Harrington's condescending expression, hearing his tone as he spoke to her, strengthened her resolve. This wasn't just about one bad judge. It was about a system that allowed such behavior to continue unchecked. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. How did it go today? Kiara smiled and replied, just as we expected. He showed his true colors. Her mother responded immediately. Be careful, baby. People like him don't go down without a fight. I know, Kiara texted back, but neither do people like us. She set her phone aside and returned to her work, carefully plotting each step of the investigation. Tomorrow, she would observe. The day after, she would interview former defendants. By the end of the week, she would have enough data to present a preliminary report to the director, and Judge Walter Harrington would never see her coming, not until it was too late. As evening fell and the office emptied, Kiara remained at her desk reviewing case files and preparing for the next day. This case mattered more than most. It wasn't just about removing one biased judge. It was about sending a message that judicial conduct was being watched, that accountability existed even for those who believed themselves above it. When she finally packed up to leave, the cleaning staff had already come and gone. The hallways were quiet, the building nearly empty. But Kiara felt energized rather than tired. Today had been just the beginning, the first step toward justice in a system that too often denied it to people who looked like her. Tomorrow would bring her one step closer to holding Judge Harrington accountable. And that was worth every late night, every careful preparation, every risk she was taking, because in the end justice mattered, fairness mattered, and making sure that no one else had to endure what she had witnessed in that courtroom, that mattered most of all. The courthouse archives smelled of dust and old paper. Located in the basement level, the windowless room housed thousands of case files organized in tall metal shelving units that stretched from floor to ceiling. The only sounds were the gentle hum of the climate control system and the occasional turning of pages. Kiara sat at a large table in the center of the room, surrounded by stacks of manila folders. She'd been there since 7 that morning, and now, 5 hours later, a clear pattern was emerging from Judge Harrington's case history. The evidence was even more damning than she had anticipated. Look at this, she said to Renee, a paralegal from the review board who had joined her for the day. Kiara pushed a spreadsheet across the table. 2 shoplifting cases, nearly identical circumstances. Both first-time offenders, both items valued under $50. The white defendant got community service. The black defendant got 30 days in county jail. Renee nodded grimly, adding the information to their growing database. And here's another one. Possession of marijuana, same amount. White college student got probation. Black college student got 6 months. The disparities are consistent across all offense types, Kiara noted, flipping through her notes. Traffic violations, minor drug possession, petty theft, disturbing the peace. In every category, Black and Latino defendants receive harsher sentences. Sometimes double or triple what white defendants get for the exact same offense. She leaned back in her chair, stretching her stiff shoulders. Yesterday she had spent 8 hours in Harrington's courtroom, documenting his interactions with different defendants. The contrast had been stark. With white defendants, particularly those from affluent neighborhoods, he was patient, even fatherly at times. With defendants of color, his tone became curt, his questions more accusatory, his sentences invariably harsher. "What about the court reporters?" Renee asked. "Have any of them noticed the pattern?" "Several have," Kiara confirmed. "I spoke with 2 former reporters who worked in his courtroom. Both said they observed the different treatment, but were afraid to report it. One tried to bring it up to the court administrator and was reassigned to a different courthouse the following week." Renee whistled softly. "So he's protected." "Very," Kiara agreed. "But protection only works when no one's willing to challenge it." She pulled out her phone and checked the time. "I have a meeting with someone who might help us do exactly that. Can you finish logging these cases?" "Absolutely," Renee said, already reaching for the next file. "Who are you meeting?" Kiara gathered her things. His former clerk. She worked for him for 3 years before transferring to family court. She reached out after hearing about our investigation. The coffee shop was 6 blocks from the courthouse, far enough that Kiara was unlikely to run into anyone connected to Judge Harrington. She chose a table at the back, ordered a latte, and waited. At precisely 1 o'clock, a woman in her mid-40s with auburn hair pulled into a tight bun approached her table. "Ms. Johnson?" the woman asked quietly. Kiara stood and offered her hand. "Yes, you must be Ms. Bennett. Thank you for meeting me." They sat, and Ms. Bennett glanced nervously around the cafe before speaking. "I worked for Judge Harrington from 2020 to 2023. What I saw during those years still keeps me up at night." "I appreciate your willingness to talk about it," Kiara said. "Everything you share will be kept confidential until formal proceedings begin." Ms. Bennett nodded, her hands wrapped tightly around her cup. "I started noticing the pattern about 6 months in. At first, I thought maybe it was coincidence. Judges have discretion in sentencing, after all. But after a while, it became impossible to ignore. Can you give me specific examples?" Kiara asked, pulling out her tablet to take notes. "There was this case with 2 young men caught tagging a building. Same charge, same lack of prior records. The white kid got community service and had to pay for the cleanup. The Hispanic kid got 30 days in juvenile detention, plus the cleanup costs. When I asked the judge about the disparity, he said the Hispanic kid had a bad attitude that needed correction. Did you document your concerns?" "I tried," Ms. Bennett said. "I kept a private log of cases where I noticed extreme disparities. After about a year, I had enough evidence that I felt I could take it to the chief judge. And what happened?" Ms. Bennett's expression darkened. "The chief judge thanked me for my diligence and said he would look into it. 2 weeks later, Judge Harrington called me into his chambers and showed me my own log. Someone had given it to him. He told me if I ever kept records like that again, he would make sure I never worked in the court system again. Said he'd claim I violated confidentiality rules." Kiara frowned. "He threatened your job." "Not just my job," Ms. Bennett corrected. "My career. My reputation, everything." She took a sip of her coffee, her hand trembling slightly. "I transferred as soon as I could, but I felt guilty ever since for not doing more." "You're doing something now," Kiara assured her. "Would you be willing to provide a formal statement?" "If you can guarantee my current position won't be affected, yes." Ms. Bennett hesitated. "There's something else you should know. Judge Harrington keeps his own records, too." Kiara leaned forward. "What kind of records?" "He has a system for tracking defendants. Stars next to names of those he thinks deserve extra attention. I once saw him write AA next to several names on his docket. When I asked what it meant, he brushed me off. But I checked later. Every name with AA next to it was a black defendant." "Do you think AA stood for African American?" Ms. Bennett nodded. "I'm certain of it. And those defendants invariably received the harshest sentences." Kiara made detailed notes about this revelation. Is there any chance these private dockets still exist? He keeps everything. Has file cabinets in his private chambers that no one is allowed to access except him. Claims they're just his personal notes, so they're not official court records. But if they show a deliberate pattern of racial profiling, they would be the smoking gun you need, Ms. Bennett finished for her. But good luck getting access to them. After finishing their meeting and obtaining Ms. Bennett's formal statement, Kiara headed back to the review board offices. The investigation was growing beyond what she had initially anticipated. What had started as documenting one judge's biased behavior was revealing something more systemic, a pattern of protection and willful blindness that extended to the highest levels of the court. In her office, she found Thomas waiting with another man she recognized as Director Powell from the review board. They both looked up as she entered. "Kiara," Thomas said. The director wanted an update on the Harrington investigation. She set down her bag and pulled out her tablet. "I was just about to compile today's findings. They're significant." Director Powell gestured for her to continue. "We're hearing rumors that you're stirring up trouble at the courthouse. Judge Carlton called me personally to express concern about, and I quote, a young attorney harassing court staff with unfounded accusations." Kiara raised an eyebrow. "Judge Carlton is Judge Harrington's golf buddy, correct? Interesting that he already knows about an investigation that's supposed to be confidential." "That's exactly my concern," Director Powell said. "This investigation needs to remain under the radar until we have conclusive evidence." "With all due respect, Director, we already have conclusive evidence," Kiara replied. She turned her tablet to show them the spreadsheet she and Renee had been building. 327 cases reviewed so far. In cases with similar charges and circumstances, Black defendants received sentences averaging 40% longer than white defendants. For Latino defendants, it's 35% longer. The director leaned forward to examine the data. Statistical evidence is compelling, but not always enough for disciplinary action. Judges have discretion in sentencing. "It's not just the statistics," Kiara countered. "I have testimonies from former court employees, including his clerk who documented his pattern of marking Black defendants' names with AA and giving them harsher sentences deliberately." "That's more direct," Thomas acknowledged. "And there's my own experience," Kiara added. "I have audio and the court transcript from my appearance before him. His behavior was textbook discrimination." Director Powell sat back, considering. "The undercover approach was unorthodox, Kiara. Some might call it entrapment." "It was necessary," she insisted, "and legally sound. I didn't misrepresent anything or induce him to behave in any particular way. I simply presented as a defendant and experienced his standard treatment." "The board will question the tactics," the director warned. "Let them," Kiara said firmly. "I'd rather defend my investigative methods than let a biased judge continue to destroy lives through discriminatory sentencing." There was a moment of tense silence before Thomas spoke. "What's your next step?" "We need access to his private records," Kiara said. "His former clerk confirmed he keeps annotated dockets in his chambers. If we can obtain those through proper channels, we'll have direct evidence of intentional discrimination. That would require a formal order from the review board," Director Powell noted, "which means bringing this investigation into the open." "It's time," Kiara said. "We have enough evidence to justify escalation." The director studied her for a long moment. "You understand that once we go public with this investigation, there will be significant pushback. Judge Harrington has powerful friends. So do we," Kiara countered. "We have the law, and we have the evidence." After another moment of consideration, Director Powell nodded. "Prepare a formal request for the review board. I'll present it at tomorrow's meeting." "But Kiara," he fixed her with a serious look, "this needs to be airtight. Judge Harrington won't go down without a fight." "It will be," she promised. After they left, Kiara stayed late into the evening, organizing the evidence, preparing the formal request, and anticipating the counter-arguments. She knew that what came next would be the most challenging part of the investigation, once Judge Harrington realized he was being officially investigated, and by the same young Black woman he had condescended to in his courtroom. He would use every resource at his disposal to fight back, but she was ready. The evidence was overwhelming, the pattern undeniable. And most importantly, the truth was on her side. Judge Harrington had abused his power for years. causing real harm to countless defendants based solely on the color of their skin. It was time for him to face the consequences of his actions. As she finally packed up to leave, Kiara thought about all the people who had suffered under Harrington's biased rulings. For them, this investigation wasn't just about removing one problematic judge, it was about acknowledging a fundamental injustice and taking the first step toward correcting it. Tomorrow would bring the investigation into the open, and with it, the real battle would begin. A light rain fell outside the courthouse as Kiara stepped from her car, legal briefcase in hand. The weight of the documents inside felt significant, not just physically but in what they represented. After 2 weeks of intensive investigation, countless interviews and meticulous data analysis, today was the day she would confront Judge Harrington directly. The review board had approved her request for access to the judge's private records. More importantly, they had authorized her to inform him of the official investigation. She checked her watch, 10:15 a.m. Judge Harrington would be on his morning recess now, likely in his chambers. As she climbed the courthouse steps, Kiara felt a flutter of nerves in her stomach. This wasn't just about professional duty anymore. It had become personal the moment Judge Harrington had looked down at her from his bench and made assumptions based solely on the color of her skin. The courthouse. Hallways were busy with the usual morning traffic. Attorneys rushing between courtrooms, clients waiting nervously on benches, clerks carrying stacks of files. Kiara nodded to a few familiar faces as she made her way to the 3rd floor, where Judge Harrington's courtroom and private chambers were located. His bailiff, Officer Reynolds, stood outside the chamber doors. He straightened when he saw Kiara approaching. "May I help you?" he asked, his expression neutral but his eyes curious. Kiara presented her credentials. "Kiara Johnson, State Judicial Review Board. I need to speak with Judge Harrington immediately." The bailiff studied her ID card, then her face, a flicker of recognition crossing his features. "Haven't I seen you before?" "Perhaps," Kiara replied evenly. "I've been observing several courtrooms recently." Officer Reynolds handed back her credentials, hesitating briefly before knocking on the chamber door. "Judge, there's someone here from the review board to see you," a muffled voice responded, and the bailiff opened the door, gesturing for Kiara to enter. Judge Harrington's chambers were exactly what one might expect. Wood-paneled walls adorned with law degrees and awards, leather-bound books lining built-in shelves, and an imposing desk that dominated the room. The judge himself sat behind it, reading glasses perched on his nose as he reviewed some document. He looked up as Kiara entered, his expression one of mild annoyance at the interruption. "Yes, what can I do for the review board today?" Kiara stood tall, shoulders back, voice clear and professional. "Judge Harrington, my name is Kiara Johnson. I'm here to formally notify you that you are under investigation for judicial misconduct, specifically regarding patterns of racial discrimination in your courtroom." The judge stared at her for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then he removed his glasses slowly, deliberately, and placed them on his desk. "Is this some kind of joke?" he finally asked, his voice low. "No, Your Honor, it isn't." Kiara opened her briefcase and removed an official document. "This is a formal notice from the review board. It details the preliminary findings of our investigation and outlines the next steps in the process." She placed the document on his desk, then took a step back, maintaining eye contact. Judge Harrington made no move to touch the paper. "And who exactly are you?" he asked, his gaze sweeping over her dismissively. "Some junior investigator they sent to deliver paperwork?" "I'm the lead attorney on your case," Kiara replied. "I've been investigating your courtroom practices for the past 2 weeks." The judge laughed, a short, harsh sound. 2 weeks? And you think that's enough time to evaluate 15 years on the bench? It was more than enough time to document a clear pattern of discriminatory behavior, Kiara said, particularly when that pattern is so consistent. Judge Harrington leaned back in his chair, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. It wasn't a pleasant smile. Let me guess. Some public defender is upset their client didn't get a slap on the wrist, so they've drummed up this witch hunt. This investigation was initiated following multiple complaints from various sources, including court staff, attorneys, and defendants, Kiara explained. The evidence is substantial and concerning. The judge stood suddenly, walking around his desk to face her directly. He was tall, using his height in an attempt to intimidate as he looked down at her. "Young lady, I've been serving on this bench since before you were in law school. I've handled thousands of cases with the utmost integrity. Whatever evidence you think you have is nothing but misunderstandings and coincidences." Kiara didn't step back. "The statistical analysis of your sentencing record shows black defendants receiving sentences 40% longer than white defendants for identical offenses. That's not coincidence, Judge Harrington. That's bias." Something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, perhaps, that she had such specific data. But he recovered quickly. "Statistics can be manipulated to show whatever you want them to show," he dismissed. "You can't possibly account for all the variables that go into sentencing decisions." "We did, actually," Kiara countered. "We controlled for prior records, severity of offense, plea deals versus trials, every relevant factor. The racial disparity remained consistent across all categories." Judge Harrington turned away, walking toward his bookshelf as if to end the conversation. "I don't have time for this nonsense. I have a courtroom full of people waiting." "There's one more thing, Your Honor," Kiara said, her voice taking on a different quality. Something in her tone made him turn back to look at her. "You may recall a young woman who appeared before you 2 weeks ago. Traffic violation, rolling stop. You dismissed the case with a warning after making several comments about her appearance, education, and neighborhood." The judge frowned slightly, trying to recall. "I see dozens of cases every day. This one might stand out in your memory," Kiara continued. "You seemed particularly interested in offering the defendant advice about respecting authority and staying in school." Recognition slowly dawned in his eyes as he studied her face more carefully. "That was you," he said flatly. "Yes, it was." Kiara met his gaze steadily. "Everything you said to me that day is part of the official record now, both in court transcripts and in my personal recording of the encounter." Judge Harrington's face darkened. "You deliberately misrepresented yourself in my courtroom. That's grounds for a complaint to the Bar Association." "I didn't misrepresent anything," Kiara corrected. "I appeared as a defendant with a legitimate citation. I stated my real name and answered all questions truthfully. The fact that you made assumptions about my education, background, and character based solely on my appearance is exactly the problem we're investigating." The judge's composure finally cracked. "This is entrapment. A setup." "No, Your Honor. This was an opportunity for you to demonstrate how you treat defendants in your courtroom. You chose to treat me with condescension and bias. That choice was yours alone." Judge Harrington's face had grown red with anger. "You have no idea who you're dealing with, Ms. Johnson. I have friends in every level of the judicial system in this state." "I'm well aware of your connections," Kiara replied calmly. "But connections can't erase evidence, and we have a lot of it." She gestured to the document still lying untouched on his desk, "including testimonies from former clerks about your practice of marking black defendants' files with AA and then giving them harsher sentences." At this, the judge went still. For a moment, genuine shock registered on his face before he managed to compose himself. "That's a serious accusation," he said, his voice quieter now. "Yes, it is," Kiara agreed, "which is why the review board has authorized this." She removed another document from her briefcase. "This is an order requiring you to provide access to all personal notes, annotated dockets, and private records you keep in these chambers regarding cases you've presided over in the past 5 years. She placed the second document beside the first. "A team will be here tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. to collect these materials. Any attempt to destroy or alter them in the meantime would constitute obstruction." Judge Harrington stared at the papers, then back at Kiara. When he spoke again, his voice had lost its bluster, replaced by something colder and more calculating. "You've clearly gone to great lengths to build this case, Ms. Johnson. I'm curious, why? What's your personal stake in this?" "Justice," Kiara answered simply. "Equal treatment under the law isn't just a nice idea. It's a constitutional right. When judges like you violate that right based on personal bias, you undermine the entire system." The judge studied her for a long moment. "You're making a mistake going after me like this. Even if your investigation proceeds, the worst I'll get is a reprimand. Judges don't get removed from the bench over something as subjective as sentencing disparities." "Perhaps that's been true in the past," Kiara acknowledged. "But times are changing, Judge Harrington. Accountability is catching up to positions of power, and in your case, we have something beyond statistics and testimonies. "And what might that be?" he asked, his tone dismissive but his eyes watchful. "We have your own words and actions recorded and transcribed, showing clear bias. We have your private notations connecting harsher sentences specifically to race. And most importantly," Kiara paused, letting the weight of her next words sink in, "we have your pattern of retaliation against anyone who has tried to report your behavior in the past." She stepped closer to his desk. 3 former court employees have provided sworn statements that they were reassigned, demoted, or pushed out after raising concerns about your sentencing practices. That's witness tampering, Your Honor, and it crosses the line from unethical behavior into criminal conduct. The color drained from Judge Harrington's face. For the first time, genuine concern showed in his expression. He wasn't just facing a professional reprimand, he was facing the potential end of his career and possibly criminal charges. "You should review those documents carefully," Kiara advised, gesturing to the papers on his desk. "They outline the full scope of the investigation and your rights in this process. You have the right to legal representation, which I strongly suggest you exercise." She closed her briefcase and turned toward the door, then paused. "Oh, and Judge, the review board has also recommended your temporary recusal from all cases involving minority defendants until this investigation is complete. That recommendation has been approved by the Chief Justice as of this morning." Judge Harrington sank slowly into his chair, the reality of his situation finally hitting home. "You've thought of everything, haven't you?" "I've simply followed the evidence," Kiara replied, "just as you've always claimed to do." She moved to the door but turned back one last time. "The team will be here at 9 a.m. tomorrow for your records. I suggest you use the time until then to consider your next steps carefully." As she left the chambers, Kiara felt a complicated mix of emotions, satisfaction that justice was in motion, but also a heaviness knowing that this was just the beginning of what would likely be a long, difficult battle. Judge Harrington's connections ran deep, and he wouldn't go down without using every resource at his disposal to fight back. But she had something more powerful than connections. She had the truth, meticulously documented and impossible to ignore. And sometimes, that was enough to bring even the most powerful people to account. The review board hearing room buzzed with quiet conversation. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating the formal space with its polished wooden tables and state seal mounted on the wall. The room was nearly full. Attorneys, court staff, community members, and media representatives filled the rows of seats, all waiting for the proceedings to begin. Kiara sat at the front table, arranging her documents methodically. 3 months had passed since her confrontation with Judge Harrington in his chambers. 3 months of intense investigation, evidence gathering, witness interviews, and preparation. The case had grown far beyond what anyone had initially expected, revealing not just one judge's biased behavior, but a system that had protected and enabled that behavior for years. Thomas leaned over to her. "Ready?" She nodded, glancing at the empty chair across the room where Judge Harrington and his attorney would soon sit. "As ready as I'll ever be." The door opened, and Judge Harrington entered with his lawyer, a well-known defense attorney named Victor Powell, who specialized in representing public officials accused of misconduct. The judge looked thinner than when Kiara had last seen him, his face drawn with stress. His trademark confidence seemed diminished, replaced by a guarded wariness as he took his seat without acknowledging anyone in the room. At precisely 9:00 a.m., the 7 members of the review board filed in and took their places at the elevated panel. The chairperson, Justice Eleanor Webb, a respected former Supreme Court judge known for her fairness and integrity, called the room to order. "This hearing is now in session," she announced. "We are here to consider the evidence and testimony regarding allegations of judicial misconduct against Judge Walter Harrington. These allegations include racial bias in sentencing, abuse of judicial discretion, and retaliatory actions against court employees." She turned to Kiara. "Ms. Johnson, as lead investigator for the review board, you may present your findings." Kiara stood, feeling the weight of every eye in the room. "Thank you, Justice Webb." She moved to the center of the room, where a screen displayed her first slide, a simple graph showing sentencing disparities. "Over the past 3 months, my team has conducted a thorough investigation into Judge Harrington's court practices. We reviewed 1,457 cases spanning 15 years on the bench. What we found was a clear and consistent pattern of disparate treatment based on race. She clicked to the next slide. In cases with nearly identical circumstances, same charges, similar criminal histories, similar evidence, Black defendants received sentences averaging 43% longer than white defendants. Latino defendants received sentences 38% longer. This pattern holds true across all offense categories. Judge Harrington shifted in his seat, whispering something to his attorney. But the evidence goes beyond statistics, Chiara continued. We have testimony from 12 former court employees, including clerks, bailiffs, and court reporters, all confirming that Judge Harrington openly expressed racial biases and treated defendants differently based on race. She presented excerpts from sworn statements, each one more damning than the last. A former clerk describing how the judge referred to Black defendants as repeat customers, regardless of their actual record. A bailiff recounting how Harrington made derogatory comments about Latino defendants' English skills. A court reporter who overheard the judge telling a colleague that certain neighborhoods only produce criminals. Perhaps most concerning, Chiara said, advancing to her next exhibit, are these documents recovered from Judge Harrington's private chambers. The screen displayed pages from the judge's personal docket notes, with clear markings next to defendants' names, AA and H beside Black and Hispanic defendants, with corresponding notes about making an example and sending a message. These annotations directly connect the disparities in sentencing to intentional discrimination, Chiara explained. They show that the longer sentences weren't coincidental or based on factors not captured in our analysis. They were deliberate choices made because of the defendant's race. Judge Harrington leaned forward, his face flushed with anger as he whispered urgently to his attorney. Finally, Chiara said, we have evidence of retaliation against those who attempted to report this behavior. She showed employment records of court staff who had been reassigned, demoted or pushed out shortly after raising concerns about the judge's conduct. This pattern of retaliation created a culture of silence that allowed the discrimination to continue, unchecked for years. For nearly an hour, Chiara methodically presented the evidence, building an overwhelming case against Judge Harrington. When she finally returned to her seat, the room remained silent, the weight of the evidence hanging in the air. Justice Webb turned to Judge Harrington's table. Mr. Powell, you may present your client's defense. Victor Powell stood, adjusting his tie. Thank you, Justice Webb. While Ms. Johnson has presented an impressive array of statistics and testimonies, we believe they fail to capture the full context of Judge Harrington's decision-making process. He argued that sentencing disparities could be explained by factors not captured in the review board's analysis, the demeanor of defendants in court, the quality of their legal representation, subtle differences in cases that might appear similar on paper. As for the personal notes, Powell continued, my client acknowledges they were ill-advised shorthand, but they were never intended as racial designations. AA referred to aggravating aspects of cases, not African American. A murmur of disbelief rippled through the audience. Furthermore, Powell argued, the staff reassignments were based on performance issues, not retaliation. The timing was merely coincidental. His defense continued for 30 minutes, but it felt hollow and desperate compared to the mountain of evidence Chiara had presented. When he finished, even Judge Harrington seemed to recognize the weakness of their position. Justice Webb spoke again. Ms. Johnson, your rebuttal? Chiara returned to the center of the room, but instead of addressing the board directly, she turned to face Judge Harrington. 3 months ago, I stood in your courtroom as a defendant. You looked at me and saw only my race. You made assumptions about my education, my family, my future, all based on the color of my skin. You spoke down to me, condescended to me, and treated me as less worthy of respect than the white defendants who came before you that day. She turned to the board. That experience was just one small example of what hundreds, perhaps thousands of defendants have endured in Judge Harrington's courtroom over the past 15 years. The difference is that I was there to document it. I was there to prove it. And most importantly, I was in a position to do something about it. Chiara held up one of the judge's annotated dockets. Mr. Powell claims AA meant aggravating aspects, yet we found no similar annotations beside white defendants' names, despite many of their cases having aggravating factors. We found no AA notations in cases where black defendants had mitigating circumstances. She placed the document down. The explanation simply doesn't match the evidence. Kiara returned to her seat and Justice Webb called a brief recess before the board would deliver their decision. As the room emptied, Kiara remained at her table reviewing her notes and avoiding looking at Judge Harrington. Thomas brought her a cup of water. "No matter what happens now, you've already won," he said quietly. "The evidence is public. People know what he did." When the board returned 45 minutes later, the room fell silent. Justice Webb's expression was solemn as she delivered their unanimous decision. Based on the overwhelming evidence presented, this board finds that Judge Walter Harrington has engaged in serious judicial misconduct through patterns of racial discrimination in sentencing, abuse of judicial discretion, and retaliation against whistleblowers. She looked directly at Harrington. "These actions violate the judicial code of conduct, undermine public trust in our courts, and cause real harm to the individuals and communities subjected to unequal treatment under the law." Justice Webb continued. "Therefore, this board recommends immediate removal from the bench and revocation of judicial privileges. Additionally, we are referring evidence of retaliatory actions to the district attorney's office for potential criminal charges." The room erupted in murmurs and whispers. Judge Harrington sat stunned, his face ashen. His attorney placed a hand on his arm, but the judge shrugged it off, his eyes fixed on Kiara with a mixture of anger and disbelief. Furthermore, Justice Webb added once order was restored, "We recommend a comprehensive review of all cases over which Judge Harrington presided, with priority given to those involving minority defendants who received sentences exceeding standard guidelines." She addressed Kiara directly. "Ms. Johnson, the review board commends your thorough investigation and courage in pursuing this case despite significant obstacles. We are recommending that you lead the task force overseeing the case review process." As the hearing concluded and people began filing out, reporters clustered near the front, eager for statements. Judge Harrington was escorted out a side door, his career and reputation in ruins. Kiara gathered her materials slowly, still processing the outcome. It had been a victory, but not one that brought her joy. Only a sense of grim satisfaction that justice had finally been served. Outside the hearing room, she found an unexpected group waiting for her. 5 young people, ranging from teenagers to early 20s, all from minority backgrounds. "Ms. Johnson," one of them, a young woman about 19, stepped forward. "I'm Talia. Judge Harrington gave my brother 6 months for something white kids got probation for. Because of that, he lost his scholarship." Another young man spoke up. "My cousin got 3 months for a first-time offense. He was just in the wrong place at the wrong time." One by one, they shared their stories. Families impacted by Harrington's biased sentencing, futures derailed by his discrimination. "We just wanted to say thank you," Talia continued, "not just for getting him off the bench, but for showing us that the system can be held accountable." Kiara felt a lump in her throat. "This is just the beginning," she told them. "The case review process will take time, but we're going to look at every sentence, every decision. If your family members were treated unfairly, we'll find it and work to make it right. Would you be willing to speak at our community center?" Talia asked. "A lot of young people there don't trust the courts. They need to hear that someone like you is fighting for fairness." "I'd be honored," Kiara replied. As she walked with them toward the courthouse exit, Kiara realized that removing one biased judge wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning of a much larger mission to restore trust and ensure equal justice. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but looking at the faces of these young people who had found hope in today's decision, she knew it was a road worth traveling. The work of justice, she understood now, wasn't just about punishing wrongdoing. It was about healing the harm that had been done and creating systems that truly protected everyone equally under the law. That work would continue long after today's victory, and Kiara was ready for it.